Welcome. We're here today at the IDEO San Francisco office. As many of you know, IDEO is a world-leading design firm. And we're here with Natasha, who is an alum of UC San Diego. She's a principal interaction designer here at IDEO. And she's worked on projects ranging from retail, clients like Nike, to transportation, Mercedes, to stuff in the beauty sector with L'Oreal. And one of the things that I think is most impressive about IDEO as an organization is you've got offices all over the globe, and you have this really wonderful, humble, low-fidelity approach to prototyping. I mean, can you tell us a little bit about how do you go about, when the world is your oyster, how do you get these design ideas?
Yeah, so one example that comes to mind is this one client project that asked us to redesign kind of the new exercise. And this was maybe dated about 5 years ago. However, our design team felt like the best way to get inspired whenever a client comes to us and asks us to define the future of X was to actually get inspiration from our world. So we went to Home Depot, because many of our prototypers and designers know that that's kind of where you start when you start building things. And they made everything in the Home Depot environment an exercise equipment. So they took everything from dollies to shopping carts to crowbars that you can find in the hardware aisle, ways to basically come up with new exercises. And they took some of those things home and took it to our shop and started to play with them. And so the idea of designing by interacting with random objects in the world basically allowed them to come through with some ideas around how you might want to use the body or how you might interact with something that is as simple as a blank piece of wood, and came together with a successful sort of machinery that's super lo-fi, but a really fun way to do new ab workouts.
So this is almost like when I played make-believe as a kid, is that you take a bucket and pretend it's a hat. That you've got these world-class designers, and they're doing the same thing that we all did when we were 5.
Yeah, exactly. Like IDEO is very, it's a place that has a lot of play. We're actually really silly, and I think design to think is kind of our mantras, which basically means really take anything and think with objects. To start designing, you need to start from somewhere as opposed to always designing on paper.
And so you got all these folks around the globe. You were telling me a little bit about when you and I talked. You talk about this collection of people as like a hive mind.
Right.
What do you mean by hive mind, and what can you do with that?
Yeah, so the hive mind is often something that we refer to collectively as to IDEO's community, but in an everyday person's world, it would basically be the people that you trust to kind of give you feedback for anything. Recommendations on places to go, to recommendations on what is the latest digital trend. And an IDEO email is one really easy and efficient way to actually tap into the hive mind. We have 13 global offices, so we ask one quick question, and within 2 minutes you have maybe a collection of 5 to 10 different emails responding to a question. One example that I'm really fond of is a project that I just came off of, and we asked, what is a sexual genre that kind of speaks to you about current everyday sex? And we asked everyone to kind of point to us at their favorite sex scene.
Like in a movie?
Like in a movie, yes. And so what we found was people in the States really felt resonant with James Bond scenes that were really idealized, kind of superhero, very dapper-like scenes. But when you kind of heard from other parts of the world, like Peru, they actually pointed at dialogue, less sort of sexual scenes that really focus on the intimacy of the woman and the man. So it's kind of a really nice, easy way to tap into a quick assessment of whatever you're thinking of and gut check.
So that's really cool because if you think about something, especially something like sex, that can be difficult to talk about. Your idea is that you're using things analogically, that metaphor plays a large role in design. And I mean, that's kind of your previous story too, that the bucket is not a bucket, it
Yeah.
becomes something else. The shopping cart is an exercise equipment. The movie scene is a metaphor for something else that's part of your values and what you think.
Totally, and I would say, sorry, what were you leaving me to talk about for this?
It's, what I love being here in San Francisco because you've got this warehouse right on the bay. It's a really beautiful space, but it's also really functional. When I come here, I realize that the Post-it notes and the markers and all of the elements of the space are very utilitarian. So it's not just a beautiful space, it's really functional. How do you apply your own design principles to the space that you've got here?
Yeah, I think it's also that IDEO kind of gives you room to make it your own space. We have a budget to kind of utilize to make the space feel a lot more fun. So specifically in the San Francisco office, we created an urban gym that started with the passion of a really awesome designer who loved CrossFit. And he said, I want to be able to take workout breaks. So he decided to go on Craigslist and get a whole bunch of free gym equipment that people were giving away. And then he basically started to prototype a gym right outside sort of our courtyard space that's in walking distance from our office, and started to work out there. And what he found was it brought a lot of followers. It started with 5 one week, and then it turned into a group of 30 different designers who said, hey, can you invite a CrossFit instructor to make this a more formalized thing? So starting with really thrown away furniture and urban gym equipment to inviting an instructor that's now sort of a popular, well-attended 3 times a week event.
And that's also a great example of using prototyping as an activism strategy. That you start small and the snowball builds. And so you don't have to have a whole conversation about, are we going to do this thing 3 times a week from the beginning. Mm-hmm. That's kind of your design to think idea, that you try it a little bit, and when the snowball rolls, then you know you're headed in the right direction.
Right, and to reinforce that, one of our mantras is kind of to basically not seek permission, but to just do and ask for permission later. And that's sort of what he did, and that's kind of a nice way to prototype in action, whether or not there's a following or if it's a failure. And those happen, but I think the idea that you can really make it your own space and you have the freedom to is really nice.
So can we talk a little bit more about how you use analogy and metaphor in design, both in this video and when I've talked a bunch, that kind of comes up again and again. Do you have another example of something that where analogy or metaphor played a role in your design process?
Yeah, I think the best example that I can think of is when we were asked by our client Netflix to help them redesign their recommendation system. And that's a really tall ask because one, it's algorithmically heavy, and then the other is where do you start? And often at IDEO we start really simply by talking to experts. So in particular, we wanted to learn how do people make recommendations, who make the best recommendations, and who make really good recommendations that we want to emulate. And so we went to a restaurant, RN74, that's local to San Francisco, and we talked to one of the best wine sommeliers in the world. And he basically sort of took us through a process of sharing us his wealth of wine knowledge to how his process of recommending a certain type of wine to you would be. And what we found was a really interesting framework that we can apply to our design of how to actually build on Netflix's current recommendation model, which was his suggestion of really taking all your wealth of knowledge and narrowing it down to 2 and helping the user choose one or the other. And so it was a very interesting human framework to apply to a very algorithmically driven recommendation system that they currently use, but kind of creating users to have an option of choice, even though it's being heavily recommended by someone like an expert.
So you're saying he always gives them 2 choices, and that way they got to pick.
Right.
And so you open the wine book and it's totally overwhelming. Kind of like on Netflix, you open the Netflix and it's totally overwhelming.
Right.
and if you give people a choice, they feel like it was theirs.
Totally.
That's cool.
And he said that it led to a lot more satisfaction and just a lot more contentment, that the choice was a really good one.
And, so I in our introduction, you mentioned that you've worked on retail, you've worked on transportation, you've worked on beauty, and you told me a story about how in one of your retail projects, you ended up at an avant-garde play in New York. That's not normally what we think about when we're checking out the supermarket.
Right. So that, again, was kind of leveraging our connections in terms of if we were to help a client like Nike redefine a retail space, where do we go in the world for inspiration? And so that led to a whole list of, excuse me, that led to a whole list of different suggestions on where to go for inspiration. And so one of the really interesting recommendations was to go to a playhouse called Sleep No More in New York, which basically takes the Macbeth play and reenacts different parts of the scenes in different parts of the studio. And what you end up having as an experience is every person who enters this big house of many different rooms with many different scenes interacted within it, a very different experience. So one might experience scene 1 and scene 23, while another might sort of see scene 10 and scene 15. And so you get a very different experience, even though there's a different destination, or even if it's the same destination. And so what we learned from that was the idea that, one, IDEO is a great wealth of knowledge, or that you can leverage your connections to really identify the best places to help you with your designs, but that you can take something that's completely not a retail space, but an analogous example and experience, and apply it to what retail could be, which we took that and said, could retail be a different destination and a different experience for people, even though it's in the same location?
Make sure we're still recording. Still on light. Yeah, we are good.
Yeah, it's a daily ritual.
One of the hardest things about getting feedback is that it can be difficult to get the feedback that's most useful for where you're at and where you need to go. You and IDEO have done this so well. What advice do you have for all of the students in this class to be able to steer the feedback and do critique well?
Yeah, I think it's setting up your environment for success, and I think it's setting up the environment for success for you as the feedback wanter and also as the feedback giver. So either role you play, it should always be really the same environment because it shouldn't be hostile or at all intimidating. It should be really a safe place. So I think everything that we do here at IDEO is making sure that people feel comfortable to share their opinions, but when they do share their opinions, it should be something that you can build on top of with enough resources so you're leaving the designer with enough to know how to steer in the right direction. So what we do often is tell our designers to set the right constraints when they're asking for feedback. So if you're asking for feedback for a particular UI design, even if you haven't done the visual design, you can basically say, hey, I want to get feedback from you all for the functionality. And that way it eliminates people commenting on the visual design when it's clearly not there, and really allowing them to focus on what you drew their attention to. And then the other thing is also helping people understand that when they do give feedback, that they should reinforce it with suggestions on how to take that. So an example would be, I don't like that font because I feel like it gives me a really bad reaction, or it's illegible. How about fonts like X, Y, Z? And that way it allows people to take your feedback with enough consideration that they don't feel offensive or offended by that. And then for the feedback giver, I think it's extremely important to make sure that they don't try to overwhelm you with too many thoughts as well. Oftentimes I feel like we have a lot of people who have a lot of opinions at IDEO, and I would say the same for any design community. And that's great. However, sometimes then you get into this paradox of choice and paradox of filtering for the feedback launcher, because they have too many ideas that may not actually work in the design constraint that they have. So I think the feedback giver should also be considerate of the idea of how much time they have, and also not giving too many suggestions to model their designs, but keeping things super simple.
So both people really need to be aware of the resources and where you are in the process and,
Right.
and what the constraints are.
Right.
Well, thanks so much for taking time with us. I mean, it's really exciting for me to be here,
Yeah.
and I mean, we'll get to see what all of the students online, where their creativity takes them. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.